Tonight in Los Angeles, the dramatic images, a well-known singer arrested in connection with the murder of a 14-year-old girl found dead in the trunk of his car.
It's really more of a figurative "I killed you," especially in the back of my mind. I try to stress that in the back of my mind. That's why I say it so loud. In the back of my mind, you died. In the back of my mind, I killed you.
I media trained you. That's controversial.
It's controversial of raping kids.
Really good.
Okay,
it's been a good one. Bye. Delete everything. Delete everything. Everything goes.
We have an update right now on a disturbing story out of California, where Los Angeles police have identified badly decomposed human remains found inside of an impounded Tesla last week.
They've identified this person as 15-year-old Celeste Rivas of Riverside County.
In Los Angeles, the dramatic images, a well-known singer arrested in connection with the murder of a 14-year-old girl found dead in the trunk of his car. Video tonight showing the tense moments as he was taken into custody and authorities on how long that victim was in the trunk. Here's Trevor Ault.
Tonight, dramatic video captured by TMZ showing the tense moments LAPD officers arrested singer David on suspicion of murdering a teenage girl who had been found dead in the trunk of his car.
It started with a smell. A Tesla, abandoned in an impound lot near the Hollywood Hills. Nothing unusual, until the odor got so bad, workers called the police. Inside, they found something that would unravel one of Los Angeles' most disturbing cases this year, connecting a missing 15-year-old girl named Celeste Rivas Hernandez to rising music star David. But this wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was a slow disappearance, quiet, unnoticed, stretching over months, until it was too late. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was born on September 10th, 2010, and she grew up in Lake Elsinore, California, in a family that had come to the United States from El Salvador in search for a better life. On the surface, her story might sound like that of many other teenagers, but the reality was a lot more complicated. By most accounts, Celeste was trying to find her footing while dealing with instability around her, the kind that slowly builds up rather than showing up all at once. In the year leading up to her disappearance, there were already warning signs. Celeste had already been reported missing not once, but 3 separate times. Each time, the process followed a similar pattern. A report would be filed, authorities would get involved, and eventually, she would be found and brought back home. On paper, these cases were resolved, but in reality, each incident added another layer to a situation that wasn't getting better. Over time, something subtle but important began to shift. The urgency that usually comes with a missing child case seemed to fade, little by little. It's not that people don't care, but repeated incidents can sometimes create a false sense of normalcy, like it's just another phase or something will sort itself out again. Meanwhile, the risks around Celeste weren't decreasing. They were quietly growing, setting the stage for what would come next. Her final disappearance happened on May 24th, 2024. And this time, things were different. After that day, there were no more updates. No calls, no messages, nothing. Her family didn't hear from her again. The last time anyone had any kind of contact with Celeste was sometime in May, and after that, it was like she had completely vanished. No confirmed sightings, no verified communication, and no clear explanation of where she had gone or who she might have been with. It wasn't just silence. It was a kind of silence that felt permanent. At first, it may not have seemed entirely out of the ordinary, especially considering her history of going missing and then returning. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, it became clear that this wasn't like the other times. Something had changed. What no one fully understood in that moment was that Celeste had already stepped into a completely different world, one that was far removed from her life in Lake Elsinore. It was a world shaped by adult influences, online connections, and dynamics that someone her age wasn't equipped to navigate. Around that same time, David Anthony Burke, better known as David, was experiencing a completely different reality. He wasn't just an up-and-coming artist anymore. He had already broken through on an international level. His music was reaching audiences across the world, and his name was gaining serious momentum in the industry. Everything about his career was moving fast, the kind of fast that usually comes with major opportunities, bigger stages, and a growing fan base. Publicly, he was known as a deeply emotional and expressive songwriter. His music often revolved around themes like heartbreak, longing, and emotional vulnerability, the kind of songs that connect quickly with listeners. In 2024, he was gearing up for some of the biggest moments of his career, including major releases and tour plans that would take him across different countries. From the outside, it looked like everything was falling perfectly into place. At some point before Celeste disappeared, their lives crossed paths.
I media trained you. That's controversial.
It's controversial of raping kids.
Really good.
Okay,
It's been a good one. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Mwah, 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 mwah. Oh my. Delete everything. Delete everything. Everything goes.
It's not entirely clear how or when the connection first began, but investigators later confirmed that David Anthony Burke, better known as David, and Celeste, did know each other. That detail alone would later become a major focus of the investigation. After Celeste's body was identified, things started to surface publicly. Photographs allegedly showing the two of them together began circulating online, adding another layer of concern and speculation. According to her mother, Celeste had mentioned having a boyfriend named David. At the time, that may have not raised immediate alarms, but in hindsight, it became a critical piece of the timeline. Her brother later shared something even more specific. He stated that around the time Celeste went missing, she had been picked up by Burke in his Tesla. That detail, combined with the sources close to the investigation were saying, began to paint a clearer picture. Those sources claimed that Celeste had been staying with him at a rental property, and that the two had originally connected online. Now, it's important to be careful here. These details aren't being presented as assumptions or speculation. They come from investigative findings and statements tied to the case. And they matter for one very specific reason. Celeste was just 14 years old. The situation placed her in close proximity to an adult with significantly more resources, influence, and freedom of movement, a gap that carries serious implications. Then, time passed. Weeks turned into months, and months stretched into more than a year. Throughout that entire period, Celeste remained missing. There were no major public updates, no breakthroughs that brought answers, and no sense of closure for her family. From the outside, it seemed like the case had gone quiet. But that silence didn't mean nothing was happening. It just meant that whatever had unfolded was still hidden. And no one yet realized that this case would soon take a turn that would place it among the most disturbing and high-profile investigations connected to a public figure in recent memory. That changed on September 8th, 2025. Up until that point, the case had been quiet, with no major developments. But on that night, everything took a sudden and disturbing turn. While David Anthony Burke was on stage performing at the Fillmore, Minneapolis as part of his Withered tour, something completely unrelated was unfolding miles away in Los Angeles. At a tow yard, a worker noticed a strong, foul odor coming from one of the vehicles in the lot. At first, it might have not seemed unusual, but the smell kept getting worse, strong enough that it raised serious concerns. Eventually, the worker decided to report it, which is when police were called in. The vehicle in question was a Tesla that had already been sitting there for a few days. It hadn't just appeared out of nowhere either. Records later showed that the car had originally been spotted parked on Bluebird Avenue in the Hollywood Hills back in late July 2025. Neighbors had noticed it sitting there, unmoved, for weeks. Then on September 3rd, it was officially cited for violating Los Angeles' 72-hour parking rule. Even after that, the car remained where it was for a couple more days, untouched. Finally, on September 5th, it was towed and taken to a Hollywood impound yard, where it sat among other vehicles. No one had any idea at that point what it might contain. It wasn't until just a few days later, when that smell became impossible to ignore, that everything started to unravel. The LAPD later confirmed that the vehicle had actually been ticketed 11 days before the discovery. That detail raised an unsettling possibility that whatever there was inside the car hadn't just been there for a short time, but had potentially been sitting there the entire period, unnoticed, as the car remained parked in plain sight. When officers finally inspected the vehicle, they went straight to the front trunk, and what they found there immediately shifted the entire case.
A body was found inside a car at a Hollywood tow lot today. There's no immediate information about the identity of the person found inside, but Eyewitness News has learned the 2023 Tesla is registered in Hempstead, Texas, to multi-platinum artist and musician David Anthony Burke, known professionally as David.
There was a black bag, and inside that bag were heavily decomposed human remains. In that moment, this was no longer just a missing person case. It had turned into something far more serious. The car itself was registered to David Anthony Burke, which instantly raised the stakes. But the condition of the remains made everything more complicated. The level of decomposition was severe, to the point where investigators couldn't identify the victim just by looking. It meant they had to rely entirely on forensic methods, and those processes take time. And as if the situation wasn't already disturbing enough, rumors started spreading almost immediately. There were claims circulating that one of the victim's fingers were missing. Now, it's important to be clear that these were unconfirmed reports, but they've added a chilling layer of mystery to an already grim discovery, fueling speculation both online and in the media. Because of the advanced decomposition, identification couldn't happen right away. Days passed as forensic teams worked to determine who the victim was. Finally, on September 16th, 2025, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed that the remains belonged to Celeste Rivas Hernandez.
Yeah, Morgan, so a really sad update here. It's been over a week that investigators have now been trying to identify the body that was found inside this impounded Tesla here in Los Angeles. And authorities have now identified that person, and they say that it's a teenager who was inside that car. And they've identified this person as 15-year-old Celeste Rivas of Riverside County. And authorities have actually confirmed that this is a young woman whose family reported her missing last year.
That confirmation came at a heartbreaking time, just one day after what would have been her 15th birthday. A moment that should have been about celebration instead became a devastating turning point for her family, marking the end of the search, but the beginning of a much darker phase of the case. Because of the condition of the remains, the medical examiner wasn't able to determine an exact cause of death. It was officially deferred, meaning there simply wasn't enough clear evidence to say how Celeste died. Investigators were upfront about this too. They acknowledged that figuring out exactly what happened would be extremely difficult given the level of decomposition. But even without a confirmed cause of death, certain details started to shape the timeline. Sources close to the case told news outlets that they believed Celeste may have died months earlier, possibly sometime in spring 2025. If that estimate is accurate, it paints a much darker picture. It would mean her body had been concealed somewhere for a long period of time, before eventually being left inside of the vehicle. Then another detail came out, one that made the situation even more serious. An LAPD captain stated that the body had been partially dismembered, though not decapitated. That single detail shifted how the case was being viewed. At that point, even without a confirmed cause of death, this was no longer being treated as just a missing person case. It strongly pointed towards the possibility of a homicide. In the days that followed Celeste's identification, everything started moving faster. Law enforcement activity picked up, and investigators began taking more direct action. On September 18, 2025, they executed a search warrant at a Hollywood Hills property that had previously been occupied by David Anthony Burke. During that search, they seized electronic materials, including a computer, anything that could potentially provide insight into what happened or help establish a clearer timeline. Not long after the search took place, another shift happened. Burke's manager terminated the lease on the property, and he moved out of the residence. At that point, it was clear the investigation had entered a much more serious phase, one where authorities were no longer just trying to identify what happened, but actively building the case around it. Not long after all of this unfolded, David Anthony Burke moved to protect himself legally. He retained a criminal defense attorney, someone known for handling high-profile cases, which signaled just how serious the situation had become. At the same time, law enforcement was being extremely cautious about what they shared publicly. LAPD robbery homicide captain Scott Williams addressed the media and made it clear that, officially, there was no named suspect at that point. He pointed to the fact that the cause of death was still undetermined, and because of that, there was still uncertainty about what level of criminal responsibility could be proven, beyond the concealment of the body. But behind the scenes, the tone was very different. Privately, investigators were already treating this as a potential homicide. They weren't just looking at what happened, but they were also looking at who might have been involved. One of the key questions was whether this could have been done by a single person, or if others may have played a role, especially when it came to moving or disposing of Celeste's body. Another detail that drew attention was a trip Burke had reportedly taken to Santa Barbara County in spring 2025. Investigators believe that timeline could potentially line up with when Celeste may have died, making it something they couldn't ignore. As more of these details started to surface, public attention intensified. People began looking at everything more closely, especially Burke's music. Fans went back through his older songs, analyzing lyrics and trying to find hidden meanings or connections, reading into lines that, at the time they were written, likely had no connection to any real-world events. Songs like Romantic Homicide suddenly started getting a very different kind of attention. People began listening to it again, but this time through the lens of the case, trying to connect lyrics to real-life events. Lines that once felt emotional or artistic were now being picked apart, analyzed, and in some cases, over-interpreted. But it's important to slow down and be precise here. Lyrics are not evidence. They're not from confessions, and they're not treated that way by law enforcement. Artists often write from imagination, emotion, or abstract ideas, and none of that can be used as proof of criminal behavior. Investigators don't build cases based on songs. That said, in fields like forensic psychology, creative work can sometimes be looked at for emotional context, especially when it's placed alongside a timeline of real-world actions. Not as proof, but as a way to understand mindset or patterns. In this situation, though, it functioned more as a reflection than accusation, showing how quickly art can take on a completely different meaning once reality enters the picture. What investigators focused on instead were the concrete, verifiable details, things they could actually build a case around. The documented connection between Celeste and David Anthony Burke, the clear age difference, the vehicle linked to the discovery, the timeline of when that vehicle was abandoned, and the fact that Celeste's remains had been concealed. Those were the elements that mattered, the pieces grounded in evidence rather than interpretation. By November 2025, the case moved into a completely new stage, one that usually signals things are getting more serious behind the scenes. According to the Los Angeles Times, an investigative grand jury had been convened to review evidence connected to Celeste's death. And that is a big step, because it means prosecutors believed there was enough material to start formally presenting it for legal review. Over the course of that month, testimony was heard, witnesses were brought in, evidence was laid out, and pieces of the case were examined more closely. But all of it happened away from the public eye. Reports even suggested that an executive from David record label was questioned during these proceedings, which shows just how wide the scope of the investigation had become.
The general manager of singer David's record label has been questioned in front of a grand jury in Los Angeles. The jury heard evidence tied to the death of 15-year-old Celeste Rivas. Her remains were found in David's impounded Tesla in September. TMZ has learned that Robert Morgenroth testified yesterday. In addition to being general manager of David's record label, he also runs the artist tours.
Now, it's really important to understand what a grand jury actually does, because there's often confusion around it. A grand jury doesn't decide whether someone is guilty or innocent. That's not its role. Instead, it looks at the evidence presented and decides whether there's enough of it to move forward with criminal charges. Think of it as a filter, not a final judgment. Another key detail is that these proceedings were completely secret by design. That means the public doesn't get to see what evidence was presented, who testified, or how strong the case might be. There are no live updates, no detailed reports, just occasional confirmations that the process is ongoing. So while this phase suggested progress, it also meant that most of what was happening remained hidden, leaving people to wait without clear answers on how close the case was to a major decision. By December 2025, no charges had been filed. The cause of death remained officially undetermined.
We believe the actual evidence will show David Burke did not murder Celeste Rivas Hernandez, nor was he the cause of her death. And we would like to be able to have the evidence come into the light of day at the earliest opportunity in order to establish that.
The LAPD sought a court order to prevent the medical examiner from releasing findings related to the case, a move that the medical examiner legally challenged. By the time the investigation reached its next major turning point, the situation had shifted again. David Anthony Burke was formally named a suspect, marking a significant change in how the case was being handled. It didn't mean a conclusion had been reached, but it did mean investigators now had enough reason to officially place him within the center of the inquiry. As 2026 began, there was still no final resolution. The investigation remained active, and the grand jury process was ongoing. No charges had been announced publicly, and no official outcome had been released. In many ways, this case was still sitting in that uncertain space between suspicion and legal conclusion, where the facts are still being tested and evaluated. Outside the courtroom, however, the impact was already very real. The consequences started unfolding almost immediately after the discovery became public. Burke's tour was canceled just days later, cutting short what had been a rapidly growing live run. The music industry also began distancing itself. Kali Uchis removed the collaboration track Crashing from the streaming platforms and publicly stated that Burke was not her friend. That kind of public separation reflected how seriously the situation was being viewed within professional circles. One by one, relationships and collaborations that had once been part of his rising career began to fracture. Even without a legal conclusion, the allegations alone were enough to reshape how he was being perceived in the industry, showing how quickly everything can change when a case reaches this level of attention and gravity. For Celeste's family, the focus was no longer on investigation updates or media coverage. A vigil was held in Lake Elsinore, and her body was released to her family. On October 6, 2025, she was buried at Queen of Heaven Cemetery and Mortuary in Rowland Heights following a private funeral service. The broader significance of this case lies not only in its disturbing facts, but in what it reveals about vulnerability and visibility. Celeste was reported missing multiple times. She was a minor. She was living in circumstances that placed her at extreme risk. Yet for more than a year, her disappearance did not trigger the level of attention that might have altered the outcome. This is not a story that has reached its conclusion. It is a case still moving through the slow, methodical process of forensic analysis in the legal system. The grand jury may recommend charges, or it may not. New evidence may emerge, or it may remain unsealed. What remains constant is the reality that a 14-year-old girl is dead, that her remains were concealed in a vehicle registered to a prominent public figure, and that the questions surrounding her death have not yet been answered. This investigation is not about music, fame, or internet theories. It is about accountability. It is about whether the systems meant to protect children functioned as they should have. And it is about whether the evidence will ultimately support criminal charges. Until that determination is made, the only responsible position is restraint. The facts must lead. The process must unfold. And Celeste Rivas Hernandez must be remembered not as a footnote to someone else's career, but as a child whose life ended under circumstances that demand truth. The melody may have drawn attention. The investigation is what matters. The story of Celeste Rivas Hernandez is not a sudden tragedy. It is a slow one. A disappearance that unfolded quietly over months, and then over a year before anyone outside her immediate world fully understood what had happened. And that is all for now. If you want to keep up with this case as it continues to develop, subscribe for future updates. Like the video if you value careful reporting over speculation, and comment below with your thoughts on what questions still needs to be answered as the investigation moves forward. See you in the next video.